Have you no fear of what might happen?
Now the podcast starts.
Happy Halloween, dear listener, and welcome to the podcast on which we talk about horror. Sometimes we talk about other things, and sometimes we do swear a bit. I am Dan, also known as TV Velasquez. I write various things about horror and about film in magazines and stuff, and I'm also a bit of an actor, sometimes sort of. I am delighted to be talking in this episode to every single one of my beloved regular co-hosts on this podcast. First of all, let's talk to the wonderful film studies lecturer and teacher, Kirsty Warrow. Hello, Kirsty, and happy Halloween.
Merry meet, Daniel. Happy Samhain.
Said like a truly paid person.
Yes.
Wonderful.
Hello. Lovely to be here.
Lovely to be here with you. So, Kirsty, what's your favourite thing in horror today? And if it's not a horror thing, that's okay as well.
Okay. It's horror adjacent. So I'm reading a wonderful book at the moment called Any Human Power by Manda Scott. I'm claiming it is horror adjacent because the sort of narrator of the book is dead. She dies at the beginning, spoilers. And it's also got, it features contemporary horror such as the internet and incels and climate crisis. So all of that's pretty bloody horrific, I think. So
are you sure you're not just watching the news?
Well, yes. It does feel very
American election coverage.
Yes.
Not yet, but I mean, I'm only about halfway through, so who knows?
Yeah, lots of news is scary at the minute. So we had a couple of other voices then. First, dear listener, you heard the wonderful and highly qualified lecturer in horror itself, Dr. Stella Gaynor. Hello, Stella. Happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween, Dan. I was toying with the idea of trying to do like a spooky ghost noise, but I bailed at the last second. I was going to go, woo. But I bailed, sorry.
That's okay. We all have to warm up before we're ready for that kind of stuff. What would you pick as your favourite thing today, whether horror or otherwise?
It's definitely horror based. So I've got four of my 6 dissertation students have chosen horror as a subject for their dissertation. So I get to supervise 4 horror dissertations this year, and I'm very pleased about that. And I've not even told them that they have to. This is their choice of their own volition. They've chosen it by themselves.
I love
someone own your minds instead of you doing it for them.
Yeah.
I love that you love your work so much that you've chosen a work thing as your favourite thing for today. Everybody should be in that position, but it's not always the case, is it? Oh, brilliant. And our final in-studio speaker for this episode is the marvellous film critic, playwright and general very clever person, Ian Winterson. Happy Halloween, Ian.
Happy Halloween, Mr. Pumpkin. Don't know why I said that.
Because I'm a terrible baldy.
What's it called? The Great Pumpkin.
I don't know.
I don't know.
Is
The
that
Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown.
Yeah, it's on Apple at the moment, that.
It's not on Apple.
It's on Apple TV.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
Oh, it's on Apple. I thought you said
Yes.
it's an apple. It's like I'm getting my seasonal fruits all mixed up here. This is some bizarre world.
Bloody hell.
It's The Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown. You're going to ask me what my favourite thing is at the moment.
Yes, I'd like to know.
It's not just horror adjacent. It's more horror than actual horror, because I'm back to being obsessed with Threads. 40 years are roundabout now since since Threads was first out, and I must have watched it loads of times. And I hope we're all right plugging other people's podcasts to people we don't know, but I've just paid a bargainish as £7.99 to have. Do you know the Atomic Hobo podcast?
I do not.
It's brilliant. I can't remember her name. Anyway, a Scottish woman does it, and she's brilliant, and she's obsessed with nuclear war, basically. So her thing is always like a history podcast about the Cold War, specifically preparation for atomic combat. But one of the regular things she does is called 4 minutes of threads, and so each episode is about 40 minutes discussing 4 minutes of threads, like bit by bit,
Right.
in honor of 4 minute warning. But it's sort of history and film theory and everything all mixed up in once. But Threads is so dense with things, references. So you'll watch something that she'll be talking about, well, why there are eggs here and why there are bottles, milk bottles here. And then also this bit of dialogue was based on real civil defense directives. and it's just an amazing thing, and you can buy it for £7.99, and it's called 12 hours of threads because that's how long it is. It's 12 hours of each 4 minute sequences, and it's absolutely fabulous. But yeah, just rewatching Threads again, I don't know how I got out of bed this morning because it's just so fucking depressing, and I love it. It takes me about 2 weeks to get it out of my brain because it's like, I always say this, but it's like looking into a parallel universe where they did it. It feels like I'm watching where, you know, the nuclear holocaust happened in 1984, next door. And it's really depressing, but just an absolute masterpiece of filmmaking.
For viewers in the UK, I think Threads is available on BBC iPlayer, and I believe it's also available on Tubi if you're a viewer in the US.
There was also a documentary, which I assume is an interview with the director, which I assume is on BBC iPlayer as well. But anyway, so that's very depressingly horror adjacent.
That movie is so frightening and upsetting that I've never watched it again, and I'm not sure I could. It's been 20 years. We were living in Sheffield at the time, so we thought it would be a laugh to see Sheffield destroyed.
It's not a laugh.
No.
Giggles thin on the ground.
Yeah.
Because you're living in Sheffield. Well, it could be worse.
Yeah. Good choice there, Ian. So my favourite thing today, and Ian, I think you'll approve of this, it's horror adjacent. It's the novel Day of the Triffids by John Wyndham. I've seen it done as a film and TV and things, but I'm only reading the novel now for the first time. And it's very, very good, and it's dated really well. It was written in the 50s. But I remember having a conversation with you, Ian, where you said you wished there was a Walking Dead kind of type series where they adapted the novel of the Day of the Triffids in the first 2 hours and then just continued on. And I feel like that's a really good instinct because I'm quite near the end of the book and I'm feeling like this story doesn't feel it's anywhere near over. It just feels like it could go on and on. Let's go down to the main topic of this episode. And this episode I'm going to call episode 100, because it feels like it's about time we should start numbering episodes. This is not technically 100. It's about 106.
This is like Jesus' birth all over again.
And indeed, I thought to mark such an auspicious occasion, we should finally talk about the movie that our podcast is named after for no particularly good reason. This movie is 1973's And Now the Screaming Starts. And because we're talking about that movie, I wanted to discuss it in the presence of all my co-hosts. So I thought it was only fair to ring up our friend Howard Whittock, the actor and film fan who is never able to join us on a Zoom conversation, but is occasionally able to answer the phone. So I wanted to get his thoughts on this. Now, this movie is 51 years old, and it's also readily available on YouTube. I think I can say that, because although it's probably not legally there, I don't think whoever owns the rights to the movie really cares. So what we'll do now is we'll hear my chat with Howard, and I'll explain the plot of the movie. I should warn you, listener, that I will be describing the entire storyline of the film, including spoilers. I should also issue a warning that the storyline does contain an incident of rape, which will be discussed in the episode. So please, if that bothers you, please turn off now. If it doesn't bother you and you'd like to see the film before you hear the discussion, please go to YouTube and watch it. There will be a link in the show notes. This is your final warning, because we are going to spoil all of it. So we'll go now to me and Howard, and we'll hear the trailer and the story of the film before we come back to the Zoom conversation.
Cue wibbly wobbly transition. Cue wibbly wobbly transition.
Hello.
Hello, Howard. How are you, sir?
Hello, Dan. What a surprise. How are you?
I'm absolutely well. I'm thrilled to be phoning you, as always.
Thrilled to be receiving this telephone communication.
It's marvellous that it helps us to keep in touch over such long distances. I'd like to ask you, what's your favourite thing in horror today? Or if it's not a horror thing, what's your favourite thing today?
Whiskers on kittens and brown paper packages tied up with string. These are a few of my favourite things when the wind blows. See, I could do the Sound of Music. I could play that part.
You could. I did say you're an actor, and you're also a person of impeccable taste.
It all began with a curse. A curse from the grave.
The evil you did this day will be avenged.
A curse of the dead hand. The dead hand that crawls, creeps, and kills. The dead hand that lives. Have you no fear of what might happen?
And now the screaming starts. For them. And for you.
So, I've written a little summary of the film here. And Now the Screaming Starts is set in England in 1795 and begins as the newly married Charles and Catherine Fengriffen arrive directly from their wedding ceremony to live in Charles's ancestral home, Fengriffen House, and its surrounding estate. However, Catherine is soon plagued by a series of spectral visions, including that of an eyeless, one-handed ghoul which molests her in her bedchamber. Catherine becomes aware that the Fengriffen family has a mysterious history which is being kept from her. After a series of individuals who might have helped her are mysteriously killed, the deaths always being prefigured by the appearance to the audience of a spectral, disembodied hand, Catherine seems to be succumbing to mania, and so Charles summons a psychiatrist, Dr. Pope, to stay at Fengriffen and help Catherine. Dr. Pope uncovers the curse which has been laid on the family dating back to Charles's hell-raising grandfather, Henry Fengriffen, who, in a demonstration of lordly privilege, had his men cut off the hand of the estate's woodsman Silas, having first raped Silas's new bride Sarah on their wedding night. Silas's response was to call down a curse on any virgin bride brought to Fengriffen. Catherine, who was a virgin bride but is now pregnant, fears that she bears the child of the ghoul which molested her, which seems to have been the ghost of the tragic Silas, while Charles fears that the pregnancy is due to an assault on Catherine by the estate's current woodsman, who is the son of Silas and also called Silas. When the child is born bearing a similar birthmark to the woodsman, Charles vengefully shoots the woodsman through both eyes, suggesting that the eyeless ghoul was a vision from the future. But the baby is also missing one hand, much like the historical Silas. This ending makes no sense, and Dr. Pope does nothing at all. So this movie I first saw at the age of 14. I've talked before, I think, on this podcast about one of the first movies, the really important movies that my sister Maureen introduced me to, was the 1972 Amicus anthology movie based on stories by Psycho author Robert Bloch called Asylum, which is a fab movie, great fun, and taught me that horror could be fun as well as disturbing. By coincidence, I think on TV the week or so following my viewing of Asylum, this film was on, which is made by pretty much the exact crew as Asylum, just a year or so later. It even has some of the same cast. So I watched it, hoping that it would be another Asylum, and I found it fairly dull, despite the fact that the cast, as well as the crossover players from Asylum, who include Peter Cushing, who plays Dr. Pope, Herbert Lom, who plays Henry Fengriffen, and Patrick McGee, who plays Dr. Whittle, also features Stephanie Beacham as Catherine. I knew her at the time from Sequest DSV and also Star Trek The Next Generation, but I now know that she was a regular on the British horror scene at this time. She'd already been in movies like The Nightcomers and Dracula AD 1972. And it's also got Ian Ogilvy from the brilliant Witchfinder General as Charles. Nevertheless, even though I didn't really enjoy this movie and quickly forgot most of the details, I did go on, of course, to continue to look for other movies that would entertain me in the way that Asylum did, and I found them, which is why I'm still a horror fan now. The only thing which really retained in my mind from this movie was the title. Although now I've actually gone back and watched it again, I've also read the novella it's based on. But what about you, Howard? What's your past with this movie?
Well, I don't think I'd seen it. I saw it earlier this year because you gave me the DVD to watch, and then watched it again the other night. And I thought, well, I don't think I've seen this since I was a teenager. Maybe I have, maybe I saw some of it, but not the whole thing. I haven't seen. And it kind of, I mean, yes, it's got a great cast and everything, but I don't think it's a great example of British horror filmmaking. Really, I don't think it's all that. It's a bit slow, isn't it? And it's a bit sort of dry. Well, I watched it. Actually, when I watched it the other day, I watched it on YouTube.
All right.
And so I couldn't find the DVD. And I was looking at the comments underneath, and somebody said something which I thought was rather perspicacious.
Okay.
It said something like, if Hammer had made this film, it would have been much better, much more effective, because they would have made it more dramatic and more sensual and more full-on and everything. And Amicus, when sometimes their films are a little bit reserved, a little bit sort of dry, a bit muted. And I thought that when I was watching it again, I thought, yes, it is. It's just a little bit detached. It's a bit passionless. It's very dry and very a bit dull and everything. And it's just like a little bit of Hound of the Baskervilles, a little bit of Jane Eyre, a little bit of The Innocents, a little bit of Hammer, all kind of bodged together, but not in a particularly kind of compelling way. It's sort of... well, first of all, the star of the film is Peter Cushing, isn't it? He gets top billing, and he doesn't even come into it until halfway through.
Well, that's true, although that's because only in the book he's the narrator, but the book begins kind of where he enters the story halfway through the movie. All the stuff before that point has been invented for the film. But it does mean that the movie kind of feels like it's two different movies stuck together.
Well, it feels like there's 60 minutes of material in a 90-minute film. So you have to stretch it out. There's one scene where Rosalie Crutchley,
yes,
a very fine actress indeed, she says to Stephanie Beacham, I can't tell you what's going on, but I can show you. So then we see her walking all along a passageway, and then she walks all the way down the stairs, and then she walks along the hallway, and then goes into the library, walks across the library, spends ages getting a book, walks back along the library, back along the hallway, back up the stairs, and you're thinking, do we need to see all this? So then when she gets to the top of the stairs, she has a funny turn, and she dies. Now, Rosalie Crutchley is a wonderful actress, but even she can't make walking up and down stairs particularly exciting.
No.
It's like everything seems to take a bit longer than it should, because they're trying to pad out this film. But at the end, I noticed there was a very long scene of the camera pans just across the house and everything, and then eventually there's a close-up on a book, and you think, well, did we need that? So that just feels like you're trying to fill in the last 2 or 3 minutes of the film because it ended early. So so it just seems a bit sort of, there's not enough material for. I mean, Amicus are famous for their anthology films, and I really love the anthology films. But they were like 20-minute stories. Whereas when Amicus tried to do a full-length film like The Skull, there just never seems enough material for the running time. Everything seems a bit stretched. And I thought with this as well, it's kind of well made and everything, but it's just so slow. And just things happen. It just seems lacking in atmosphere and tension and, you know, and you can't really get involved in it. It seems a bit passionless.
I mean, the thing is, having read the book, it's based on a novella. Most movies that are based on books have to cut out and rearrange things. This movie has to add loads. It includes pretty much everything from the novella. And it does have a sense of being expanded. How about this, Howard? I'd like your take on this. I think on my initial viewing when I was 14, I think I just blocked it out of my mind. I didn't really remember much about it. I just had an impression that, it's quite boring. It's more interesting to watch again now, having read the book that it's based on. And there's a lot more to it than I remembered. But, the overall impression was kind of dullness, really.
It is dull, and it's just slow, and there's just a lot of padding. And when Peter Cushing comes in, he's great, because he's such a great actor, and he makes it more interesting.
He has some good lines as well, I think.
Yeah.
That aren't from the book. They've given him some of those nice Peter Cushing waspish lines, like Baron Frankenstein would say that he delivers really nicely. Like when he comes into the room and Ian Ogilvy says, I thought you got lost in the woods, and he says, how kind of you to go out to look for me.
Yes, he does that very well. He does everything very well. I mean, yeah. So it's great when he's in it, but it's just... And you know, kind of like Ian Ogilvy stuck at playing this kind of dimwit, because like 3 people die in the space of about 2 days. Mm-hmm. The lawyer gets killed with an axe, and Rosalie Crossley falls down the stairs, and Stephanie Beecham's auntie dies of a heart attack. And he's just saying, oh, don't worry, it's just a heart attack. Oh, it's just natural causes. And you think, come on, you idiot. There's 3 people dead. Your wife's having all these visions and apparitions. God's sake, do something about it. But he's got to play this sort of dullard, you know, who just kind of dismisses everything. And, that's kind of infuriating. And Stephanie Beecham, they're all very good. They're all very good actors in this film.
They are, yeah. It's a good cast.
They haven't got much to work with, you know, kind of thing. They're just trying to... And Patrick McGee, that is Patrick McGee.
Have you no fear of what might happen?
He only did it for about 5 minutes as a doctor.
Yes.
You know, kind of like, you know, I mean, you know, just a bit more Patrick McGee. I did notice all the many similarities between this film and Asylum.
Pretty much exactly the same crew and a lot of the same cast, I think.
And a lot of the same music.
Yes, yeah.
Because the scene where the lawyer rides upon a horse is the music, exactly the music from Asylum, where Herbert Lom makes his doll come to life.
Yes. Yeah.
Kills Patrick McGee again.
Well, the one that I noticed was when the woodsman appears in the graveyard. He jumps out from behind the grave and frightens Stephanie Beecham. That's the music from the end of Asylum.
Yes, yeah. And I kept thinking, I think I'd rather be watching Asylum, actually, because that's...
Asylum is great fun. I mean, I went on about it for 2 hours on the Very British Horror podcast. A podcast which is sadly no longer available on Podbean, but the wonderful hosts Chris Denton and Paul Monk have given us permission to host the episode about Asylum on our podcast feed. So, dear listener, if you'd like to hear it, you can click on that straight after you've heard this episode. I could just talk about Asylum forever. It just goes to show that everyone making this film had great talent.
Yes, but not much enthusiasm, because I think once they saw the script, they realised that there's not a lot they could do with it.
Right. Well, that may be true. That may be true.
Because these are the kind of films I watched, like I say, when I was young, when I was a teenager, so I probably would have enjoyed it a lot more then. Just because I liked that thing so much, and it was part of that genre. But now you look at it and you think, well, it's. But I do have a certain kind of affection. I don't think it's terrible. I think it's certainly watchable.
Yes, I think
so. In it. But you kind of feel the whole horror cycle that started with Curse of Frankenstein in '57. This is now 1973. It's sort of coming to an end. They've run out of ideas a bit. Hammer's doing Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell and things like that, which isn't very good. And we've kind of, it was tremendously successful when it started over 10, 15 years, but now they kind of run out of ideas. There's a lack of inspiration and a lack of enthusiasm now and a lack of energy for it. And, they just kind of go through the motions a bit. And this is what you end up with. It's just, you kind of feel like they're making because they've got to make it, not because they particularly want to make it.
Here's a question. Do you think this movie should have been more violent? Because I feel like it's weirdly stayed, although when it does have gruesome things in it, like the eyes that are shot out and the crawling hand, all that kind of gore stuff is really well done, I think. I think the effects in this movie stand up quite well. But maybe it just should have had more of that and been more exciting.
Violence, but just more atmosphere, more use of lighting and shadow and colour and sound and, just the things that make it more atmospheric, like the kind of stuff that Hammer did. It just looks rather bland all the time and it's not that.
I think my theory is it needed a more prepossessing musical score. It needed a different score. I think everything else might knit together quite well if it had.
Because apart from the Asylum music, it's just his usual plinky plonky, tinky tonky kind of music that he does, which to me I don't like. It doesn't.
Yeah, we're talking about Douglas Gamley, the composer here.
Yeah.
And I think it's okay, but I think that it relies far too heavily on that kind of soppy love theme that is the main theme of the score. And I think the movie needs a different atmosphere, something more devilish to it, to counterpoint.
Trying to make it romantic, as much a romantic film as a horror film, and it doesn't. That doesn't work either because it's not romantic enough.
But it's not a romantic story. It doesn't have a happy ending.
Well, I thought about the ending as well, because at the ending, Stephanie Beacham goes into a kind of catatonic trance, and her eyes are staring. But at the beginning of the film, she says, "Oh, I often dream of going back to the house and."
Yeah, that's true.
It was horror. Well, that presumably means in the future she's all right.
Yes. Yeah.
So, that's a bit odd.
That's a good point. That's a very good point.
I kind of think about this film is that somebody in 1973 at Amicus was going through the prop storeroom and found that mechanical hand that they used in Dr. Terror's House of Horrors, and they found it and took it to Milton Subotsky and said, "What do you want to do with this?" And Milton Subotsky says, "Hey, that thing cost a load of money. We should use that again." So they wrote a film or found a script where they could use the crawling hand. And the crawling hand is very good.
I think that might be true because the crawling hand is not in the book.
No.
But it does look good.
Very good.
And I think you're probably right, it is the same prop as the Dr. Terror's one, but they've spruced it up. It looks better, I think.
It looks better. It actually looks good. I said, "You're right, the special effects are good. I mean, they are effective, and Jeffrey Whitehead's makeup and everything, he's very good as well."
He is, yeah.
Even though he's got very kind of low billing, considering he's got one of the main parts, he's sort of like right down the list. But yeah, it is made by craftspeople. They know what they're doing. But it's just, when something doesn't work, it usually comes down to the script, and I think the script is the problem here. So there's not enough material for the length of the film. It's too stretched out. It's not compelling enough. It's not interesting enough. The characters aren't sort of engaging enough to really get involved in the story. Even if you've got these great actors playing them, there's only so much they can do, and it's just it just comes off a bit bland and a bit sort of dry and a bit tedious. And
I think that might be fair enough. But I think there are interesting things in the script and the story to talk about. We'll go into detail on that when I go back to the studio now with Stella and Kirsty and Ian. I think my final thought for this conversation on And Now the Screaming Starts is great title. Somebody should use that for a podcast. But I think maybe they should have also used it for a different movie.
Yes. Well, it does offer the possibility for people to make little comments like, and now the yawning starts, and then now the snoring starts, and all this.
Right. Yes, that's true. Yes.
The thing is, I've just had a go at it and said how boring it is, but I still really like it just because it's part of my childhood. And those actors, Peter Cushing and Patrick McGee and all those actors, and I watched them when I was a teenager, and I love all that stuff. So this is just a lesser example of that thing which I really like.
Yes, I would agree there. Yes, I find it an easy watch, despite everything I've said. I think it's a fascinating adaptation, actually, but we'll get into that in the main studio discussion. Well, Howard, thank you very much for giving us your two-pennathon, And Now the Screaming Starts.
It was entirely my pleasure.
Oh, no, it was entirely ours.
Well, then it was entirely yours.
Thank you very much. We shall speak on these subjects again, Howard. Thank you so much for your thoughts.
Yes, you take care of yourself.
Wibbly wobbly transition. Cue wibbly wobbly transition.
Okay, so now we're back on the Zoom call with Stella and Ian and Kirsty, and we're going to discuss all of our other thoughts about the movie. I'll start off because I did a little bit of research for this movie. It was my idea that we should talk about this movie and indeed rip off its name for the podcast. And I should probably apologise to another British horror-themed podcast, Hammer House of Podcast, because they gave me the idea of just take the title of a thing and replace one word with the word podcast, and that's fine.
So we're not the only ones. There's the last podcast on the left.
Oh, yes, that's true. Yeah, they're with pioneers.
So, you know,
but
it's fine.
I mean, maybe that they have more legitimacy. It kind of works. That title works so well, I never actually noticed that they're just using that technique. It's the same technique we've used. So it was a movie I saw long ago. The title was much more memorable than anything else about it, but I've of course rewatched it for this discussion. But also I've read the book that it was based on, so I'd like to talk a little bit about that. So this movie was made by one of Howard and I's favourite British horror production companies, Amicus Productions Limited, which had set up in the mid-60s as a rival to the more famous Hammer Studios, but making a subtly different kind of horror movie. They often employed the same on-screen and behind-the-stage talent as Hammer, but the movies were different in style. Hammer films tended to be based on classical Gothic texts. Amicus films tended to be set in a more modern era and tended to be based on more recent literature, often American literature, possibly because the producers who headed Amicus Productions Limited, although the company was British, they were Americans, Max J. Rosenberg and the marvellously named Milton Subotsky. The novel that this movie was based on was quite recent. It was only published in 1970, 2 years before the movie was produced. Although, of course, both the film and the novella that it's based on are Gothic texts. They have period settings and draw upon the Gothic themes of madness, fears of sexuality and things like that we are used to from Gothic literature and movies. But the book was actually written by an American, David Case. Ian, he's a contemporary of and a friend of your friend Ramsey Campbell. He was a literary writer in the 70s and 80s, didn't really write many novels, but wrote a lot of short stories. The novella that this film is based on was called Fengriffen, and it is one of his longer pieces. It was republished in 2015 in an anthology by Valancourt books, which is where I read it, and I'd recommend that anthology. It's got a nice, it's edited by Stephen Jones, and there's some nice context about the author there. There's also a nice afterword by Kim Newman, looking specifically at the film and Now the Screaming Starts and analysing that. When Amicus bought the rights to Fengriffen, they assembled a tried and trusted crew to make it. They had recently brought on board the director Roy Ward Baker, who had made Gothic horror films for Hammer, such as 1970s bisexual vampire romp, The Vampire Lovers. And he reassembled his crew from a movie that he made for Amicus a year before, which Howard and I mentioned, Asylum, which was falls into the category of movie that Amicus more regularly did and were better known for, kind of contemporary set horror anthologies, such as Dr. Terror's House of Horrors, which Howard and I also discussed in depth in one of our earlier episodes in this podcast. I read the novella before rewatching the film and I enjoyed it, but my first impression really was that this seems quite unfilmable. They must have changed quite a lot of it. I was taken by the writing style. You would never think it was written in 1970 by an American. It's a very successful adoption of the language style of classical Gothic literature. This is a novel where I had to consult a dictionary almost every page because there were archaic words being used that I didn't recognise. There's a very memorable moment where the narrator talks about the olfaction of decay, for instance, rather than the smell of decay. But the reason I felt it was unfilmable was because it's both very, very psychological and based on interior fears. A lot of the novella, the scenes in the novella are people sitting around talking to each other about the things they worry about. There's not a lot of action in it, but also some of the flashback scenes, some of the sequences that are described in these conversations are really unpleasant, and I imagine them being very explicit. There's the curse that motivates the plot centers on a historical rape, which is so unpleasant to read in the book. I felt like maybe Sam Peckinpah would have filmed this as I imagine it, but I can't imagine Amicus doing so. But what I found when I watched the movie was that it is very faithful to the book, although what it does is it essentially adapts the novel in the second half of the movie. The point at which Peter Cushing's character, Dr. Pope, arrives in the movie, that is the beginning of the novel, and his character is the narrator of the novel, and it's he who has events from the past and from the recent times described to him by the characters, and we see everything through his eyes. But in a way, the book is not about him. It is about Charles and Catherine, and he is fulfilling a role similar to that of the character of Lockwood in Wuthering Heights. That book's not about him, but the introduction to the world and the characters that we get in the first few pages is all through his eyes, and that's kind of Dr. Pope's role here. In a way, they could have made this movie without that character being in it, because you don't need a viewpoint character when it's a movie, but they chose to have him in it, which may be a flaw. The events in the first half of the movie are kind of based on things related in the book that are described as having taken place in the past, but there are a few embellishments. So, for instance, the horrible historical rape scene includes in the movie a moment where a man's hand is cut off. In the novel, the novella rather, it's not his hand but the fingers of one hand that are cut off, which kind of explains why the wound is not fatal. In the movie, you may question why he doesn't bleed to death from having had his hand chopped off, although the reason why that change has been made, I think, is just because Amicus had access to a very good crawling hand prop, which they'd used previously in Dr. Terror's House of Horrors and also in Tales from the Crypt, and they wanted to make use of it again. And in fact, it is the hand, the crawling hand, which is the main image on the poster of the movie. The device that is used in the first half of this movie, in which characters who find out about the information that Catherine needs to know or try to help her in some way are killed, and their death is kind of foreshadowed by the appearance of the crawling hand. That's an invention for the script. There's no such thing in the novella. Something else from the novella which makes it into the movie but in rather changed form is the plot thread about Catherine's, to quote from the Malleus Maleficarum, in which she reads, quote, sexual congress with demons, unquote. In the film, it's implied that she has had sexual relations with a ghost, in this case, the ghost of the woodsman, but in the novella, she's actually in fear of the idea that she is being visited nightly by an incubus which is raping her, and Dr. Pope takes this to be an expression of her own fears about her sexuality and moral qualms with her sexual desires, and there are hints and references here to the moral conventions of the time that Gothic literature springs from. What it does do is make the novella a more satisfying story than the movie, because although the action is almost identical, the novel is a little bit more disciplined in the way it employs these ideas, and therefore is able to kind of pull off a twist ending that the movie cannot. I did enjoy the novella, and I think I enjoyed the movie more for having read the novella, and I would recommend the novella for anyone to read who enjoys Gothic fiction. But having wanged on about this movie and this novella myself for ages now, I'm quite intrigued to know what you all thought of the movie. Obviously, you didn't read the novella, you were just taking it as a movie on its own terms, and I'm definitely intrigued to hear what you think. Who would like to give us the first thought?
Boobs.
That's the first thought. That is
well, yeah.
From the Facebook chat that I saw ahead of this recording, I could have anticipated that first word.
Can I chip in and go first, just in terms of I genuinely with this, aside from anything else, so we will obviously talk about the boobs and other things as well, is like I had no idea when I was watching this film who the fuck I was meant to be rooting for or caring about, because I didn't care about her particularly. It's like, am I meant to, am I meant to be sympathetic to the husband? No, because he's an idiot. And then, and then when we do have the doctor character turns up, I kind of felt it's interesting what you said about the novel, the novella rather, because when he turned up, I thought he would have been a great person to have at the beginning of this. Yeah, have like a way to sort of understand what this relationship is, why. It just like it sort of lacked a kind of a sympathetic character that I gave a crap about. I love Stephanie Beacham, but she I feel like for the first half of the movie she was wandering around like imagining that she was in a very different movie. A much more sort of picture postcards movie with beautiful backdrops and costumes and bosoms and stuff like that. And like at every turn, she turns around, she sees something bizarre and is scared. And then like she reverts back into this, I'm in this lovely world, it's all lovely. And then no, something that, and there's a moment about halfway through where she just starts to laugh.
Yes,
And
yeah.
I felt like this
Bad
is the
luck.
moment that she's realised what kind of movie she's in.
Yeah. I think, to be fair to her, I don't think the movie really knows what kind of movie it wants to be up to that point, or possibly ever.
I mean, right from the beginning, it has that sort of, almost like Rebecca, last night I dreamt.
Yeah,
of
the
Mandalay
Mandalay narration
kind of bit.
opening,
And
yeah.
then it goes, what's this film going to be called? And now the screaming starts with an exclamation mark. And it's like, okay, that was a tonal shift from the opening line. And then then exactly like Kirsty said, it kind of goes, it's all pretty, it's all pretty. Oh no, it's like Carry On fucking Screaming. It's ridiculous. It's really, I can see why it's a cult classic, because it's a bit shit.
Oh no, it's not really a cult classic. I mean,
Well, we're going to make it a cult classic.
yes,
Do we have
I
to?
feel like
It's
people-
worth watching, and it's funny, and it's also but it's quite unpleasant as well.
Yeah.
It is.
The sexual politics are definitely unpleasant.
Oh god, yeah, absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. But bonnets,
Boobs and bonnets.
boobs and
Bonnets
bonnets.
and boobs.
Yeah.
Bonnet work in this film is it's like peak bonnet.
Yeah, it's top tier bonnet.
Yeah, yeah. It's an utterly ludicrous film that I don't know why the podcast is named after it, and I assumed
Yeah.
Howard would be like absolutely nuts for it, and it would like he'd just be like, I don't care what anyone says, this is an amazing film, but he didn't particularly like it either. So,
No,
does anybody on this
nobody
podcast
likes it.
like the thing that we're named after?
I mean,
No.
I did not name the podcast after the movie. I named it after the title of the movie, which, to be fair, is a title they just slapped on the movie.
And we just slapped it on the podcast.
Yeah, exactly. But I think it makes sense in that situation. I think the novella is called Fengriffen, which the film producers
makes
obviously
sense.
felt. It does make sense, but also it's maybe not very exciting.
Podgriffin from now on.
In my research for this, I found out that they actually wanted to call the movie I Have No Mouth, But I Must Scream. That's a famous science fiction story by Harlan Ellison.
Oh, okay.
And for some reason, the producers of this movie thought it would be a good title for this, and they had form in this department. They adapted a novel called The Disorientated Man a couple of years before this, but they called it Scream and Scream Again, which Howard and I talked about in an earlier episode. So they love titles with the word screaming, but they actually, because I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream is a story that was owned by someone, they had to ask Harlan Ellison's permission to use his title on this Gothic horror movie, and he said, probably his exact words, fuck you. So they had to come up with something else. So apparently Milton Spotsky, the producer, just went, and now the screaming starts. So,
but it's an accurate description.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Literally, like you were saying, Kirsty, she literally, I mean, I was laughing from when it first came in, when the title first came in, but like literally, it's like, so Stephanie, you're going to see something dreadful out of your shoulder. Can you widen your eyes and scream? And that's every 5 minutes in the fucking film.
Yeah.
It's
true.
And also, the part of the film where she ought to be fucking screaming when she's giving birth, she sounds like she's orgasming. So, just...
Oh, God. Why? Right.
Go on, Stella. We've not given you a good chance to give us your first impressions or your top thoughts.
I did start with the word boobs, but
you did give us boobs, so to speak. So yeah.
There is a lot of focus on the boobs. We've already mentioned the bonnets. I know Kirsty wanted to talk about the makeup and the costume, so I'd like to introduce that by asking why have they dressed her like a 60s sex kitten, but then put her in a big puffy sleeved dress. But her makeup was really odd for the character and the rest of the film, because her face looked like she should be in a Bond movie, but the
Right.
rest of it just didn't fit. And I don't know if it was the tits, I don't know if it was the false lashes, but it did not. None of her, the way that she'd been put together, fit. And then they'd put a big bonnet on her, so I just didn't know what I was looking at.
Right.
It was the stupid
70s glamour.
in a long time.
Wild. What did you want to say about their makeup?
No, it was pretty much that, actually. It was just the fact that it all felt really incongruous to the genre.
Yeah.
And because of their, I mean, I don't know whose choice it was to have her look like that all the way through. I mean, she looked amazing.
Yeah, she's looked stunning, but
Yeah.
But it, that sort of sense of a character sort of descending into something unpleasant is just like visually not there. And because the script isn't very good and she doesn't have there's no space for her to escalate or to she ends up being kind of very one note in it, because the costume doesn't change, the hair and makeup doesn't change. Like, even when she's pregnant, we don't actually get to see her be pregnant. We just know she is. And then she gives birth, which looks like, as I mentioned before, there's a weird shot where she's like gripping the back of the bed.
Yeah.
And then there's these moans, and it feels like is she having sex? And then oh no, she's having the baby. And then immediately after, we see her being somebody who's had children, that idea of, in the long shot, she's got a perfectly flat stomach minutes after giving birth. And you just go, I appreciate that she's obviously meant to be a beautiful woman. She is a beautiful woman. She's obviously a kind of star of this age, but I just didn't understand that sort of dedication just to want to make her look, like that kind of, very fixed star image, rather than use the costume, the hair and the makeup to kind of take her on a journey.
She could have looked a little less perfect, because everything's unraveling around her, and you can use costume and makeup and hair to tell that story. So like, if you watch the thing that I was thinking about when you mentioned makeup made me think about it's horror adjacent, I guess. I was thinking about Fatal Attraction and Glenn Close's character, and she starts really looking perfect and alluring and attractive. So, she has the affair with Michael Douglas. He has the affair with her. But by the end, her hair's wild and her makeup's all over her face. And it's really simple, but it shows that she's just gone. And in this film, admittedly, it was 1973, but like, they understood hair and makeup enough to do it well on her, but didn't use it at all. And she just ended up looking there like a sex kitten from a 1960s, slightly softcore porn film.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it basically was kind of. I mean, it was just like a schlock B movie.
Yeah.
Its important thing was to look like the sort of film that it comes out as a double bill. The poster was probably more important than the actual film, because they just needed people to buy the ticket. It looked nice, in that kind of way, but it was trying to be. I mean, it was trying to be a Hammer movie, which is a certain type of movie, but it was also a cheap as chips version of something that's already quite cheap.
Yeah.
And then the script was rubbish. And then on top of that, it was unpleasant when you get down to it, because it's all about, male revenge through the medium of virgin brides being violated. So, just a bit grim.
I mean, it sort of had that Game of Thrones-esque kind of thing, which is, let's use, the rape of women as a way of furthering our male, kind of motives.
I mean, sorry. Yeah, no. I'm saying if it had been, I guess the way to, if it had been like Rosemary's Baby, where you make it A, it's a really good script, and B, the person who's at the center of this evil web is the protagonist, then and she's trying to do something about it, then I guess that would be sort of more acceptable. But it's the fact that nobody's really the protagonist, like you were saying.
Yeah.
And then it's just, and she's just this thing that things are happening to.
The one person
more than it's horrible game.
Yeah.
And then she has a baby with a birthmark, because birthmarks are obviously wrong.
Yeah.
Well.
I know. Poor baby. The one character I did feel sympathy for was the woodsman guy. You know, just because. And I thought that it was an interesting idea in the middle of the story about this idea of the kind of, you know, kind of prima nocta, kind of, you know, the exploitation of the working classes by the, you know, evil, you know, kind of aristocracy.
Yeah, the backstory, which is kind of it seems a bit inspired by the backstory in The Hound of the Baskervilles. But it's kind of it's horrible. You know, that whole scene is hard to watch, but on the other hand, it is quite powerful. Both and it's exactly what happens in the book as well. You know, and I think, as Howard mentioned, I think Jeffrey Whitehead, who plays the woodsman, is very good. I mean, well, to be fair, I don't think there's any particularly bad performances in the movie.
No, I mean Herbert Long
with what they've got.
Yeah,
which is not much.
No, everybody's doing the best with the material that's rather thin. I'll just talk a little bit about the script. The script is by Roger Marshall, who is a writer who's I've recently come to be rather a fan of through our friend Ross. I've discovered a series he created on ITV in the mid-60s to mid-70s called Public Eye, which is a fantastic series that's really hard to sell to people who've not seen it, because it is the most low-key detective drama ever. It's about a private eye and nothing really happens. It's so underplayed, but it's brilliant, and it's very character focused and really well written. It feels very real. There's an episode which has one of the earliest and very non-stereotypical portrayals of a lesbian on British television, and she's actually played by Stephanie Beacham. So I wonder if it's through Roger Marshall that Beacham got into this. Jeffrey Whitehead is also in that show. He's a good writer, but maybe he had too much respect for the script, for the book that he was adapting, because he actually doesn't change that much about it, but the changes he does makes are kind of bizarre. And something that I thought when looking at it, or thinking about it after I spoke to Howard about it actually, was there's a weird, we're not sure what to do. The book does one thing, we should do the other, but we'll try and do both. And you even get that right at the beginning, because she says in the opening narration of the movie, my mind often drifts back to the year 1795, to the time when I was happy, when my nights were filled with horror.
In my dreams, I go back to the year 1795, to a time when I was happy. I was on my way to be married. I was going to the house in which I was to find my days filled with fear, my nights filled with horror.
And I was like, what? Were you happy, or were your nights filled with horror? Did you like the horror? And then, like, at the end,
I mean, to be fair, she could be like us. She could be a horror fan.
Well, to be fair, yeah. But then there's like the thing at the end where in the book, and it's quite a nice twist at the end of the story, but in the film they kind of go, well, we are going to make it the woodsman who is the father, but also we're going to say he was a ghost, because he's going to kill him. The husband's going to kill him at the end by shooting his eyes out, and the ghost had no eyes. So it was the woodsman all along. Aha! But he wasn't dead at that point.
No.
So,
but there's you could argue this is kind of House on Haunted Hill logic, couldn't you?
You know what? I've still never seen House on Haunted Hill. What do you mean by that?
She's like a psychic.
Oh no, not no, The Haunting of Hill House. Sorry.
Yeah.
That kind of bent neck lady logic.
Yeah.
Oh, as in, she's seeing her own future kind of thing.
I mean, it's not. Also, the point is, it's not consistent, though, is it? It's not clear what it's trying to do. I was really confused about, like, are we just? Is this, is the woodsman in her age? Is he a descendant of the original guy, or is he the original guy? Is he a ghost, or is he not a ghost? Who knows what the fuck's going on?
So they suddenly have that with the Bible at the end, don't they? That it's like going to be unto 4 generations.
Yeah.
Just be like, okay, is that why you've waited 4 generations? I don't understand.
Well, there was a really interesting reading of it given on the podcast, Hammer House, a podcast where they did an episode about this. where Liz Miles said that she thought that the Bible bit at the end meant that they'd been subject to a judgment of God, and that they were unclean in God's eyes, and therefore were to be subject to this curse. So that doesn't mean that the ghost was God, but kind of God was letting all this happen. But I think that might be a stretch. Sorry?
A bit like Inspector Calls.
A bit like it. Well, indeed. That's a comparison.
I mean, they're almost in the same category, I guess, of classics.
But yeah, like Kirsty says, though, it's confusing, isn't it? Because like the ghost that we see, yeah, it's got the eyes shot out, so it could be the woodsman in the future, but it also has the chopped off hand. So therefore, is it supposed to be the woodsman from the past, the father of the woodsman, Silas?
It's also very confused because you get the impression it's something to do with the portrait of the grandfather, because that's where he keeps coming out of that portrait.
Well, I tell you what, though, the portrait of the grandfather just gave me the thought that this was a great job for Herbert Lom. He gets second billing, was probably paid a reasonable amount of money, and he's in a great deal of this movie, but mainly as a portrait. All he had to do was sit there.
That's an easy day.
Him. Yeah.
Well,
So
he sent in his spotlight photo. He had to sit there, but yeah, it's a very odd movie. Blood on Satan's Claw is a far superior film, but that suffers from a similar kind of thing of being a weird portmanteau film that's weirdly episodic, doesn't quite have an protagonist. People come and go.
Yeah.
It's almost, that's kind of, in a weird way, maybe that's just the sort of style they're going for, is people do come in at the midpoint and we do switch to new episodes. So Cushing arriving at the midpoint is kind of all right because it's the middle of the film and it's a bit like, okay, well, all those people are dead. Here's a new lady with a bonnet on to clean the house, and here's Dr. Pope, and we've still got Stephanie Beacham going mad.
Still got her tits. Good.
But there is literally no real progression. She just does the same thing until right at the end when she's actually really good at being mad right at the end. But there's been no descent.
No,
she's just really good at being mad at the end. But up until that point, all she does is be kind of normal and see scary things and scream
a lot. I think my favourite bit was when she goes outside. She first sees the woodsman, is it? And there's that little graveyard, and there's fog, but the fog knows to only stay in the little graveyard.
Yes,
it's not spilling out into the rest of it.
I was really looking around, going, there's a dry ice pipe. And
there was two.
The
fog was just here and nowhere else. So I liked that.
What was there a slight hint of Lady Chatterley's lover? Like there was supposed to be some sort of. Does she quite fancy this rude mechanical as well? Is that sort of in the book that she kind of has? She's maybe like, oh, look at him with his hands. He's got two hands, and she quite fancies him.
Yeah, no, not really in the book. No, he's kind of more monstrous in the book.
Ew.
Oh, really?
But she has demons raping her each night, so she's focused on that.
It sounds even dodgy. It sounds almost like, was he buying into the sort of rape fantasy bollocks as well in the book?
Maybe a little bit. It doesn't,
because the film's got maybe hints at stuff like that, and it definitely, in a similar way to the rape scene in Blood on Satan's Claw, there's a little bit, well, maybe quite a lot of titillation being there. That sort of film, violence against women for titillation, is definitely something that just, I don't know. I wouldn't say it wouldn't happen now, but we certainly wouldn't approve of it. I'm sure some films would do it now, and it'd be awful.
I mean, to be fair to this film, I think there is not much in it that I would describe as titillation, really. And even though we keep using the word tits, I should say there's
lots of titillation in it.
There's lots of cleavage, but the stuff like the rape scene and things like that, they're kind of horrible, but also not explicit. It's like you know exactly what's happening.
Yeah,
But,
no, I know, but okay, not explicit, but it does sort of linger on the idea of the suffering.
Yeah.
You know, and the female suffering in particular. So we don't really, kind of and I did think about this at the time, particularly with the one that's in the flashback, is that we hear what's her name, Sarah?
Yes.
The wife.
Yeah.
Her screaming. But we don't hear the aggressor, and I just thought it was a really interesting choice. So all of the emphasis is on her screaming rather than, kind of his aggression against her, in that audio.
Yeah.
Okay. I suppose
the curse is particularly grim as well. The whole I'll violate your
yes,
virgin bride in the family or something. It's all horrible, really.
It is maybe
And
because
the women are just sort of on both sides of the argument. Are just kind of used as property. And that there would be a way of doing that without, and it's being some sort of statement, but by having the women maybe have some agency in the middle of this horrible dynamic, but they don't.
Yeah,
They're literally just
no.
I suppose because you can only hear the female suffering, my reading of it is that that's suffering and I'm not supposed to enjoy it, but perhaps they were intending to present that as enjoyable. But I do think that this movie doesn't go far as other 70s movies like Blood on Satan's Claw that Ian mentioned in presenting that in a way that could be titillating or seems. I don't know what was on their radar. The guy who directed this film, Roy Ward Baker, was a really good director who occasionally got it really right. He directed A Night to Remember, the 50s movie about the sinking of the Titanic, which I watched
that fairly recently.
I think that's like a perfect movie, but he later segued into a horror career where he doesn't always seem very sure what he's doing. He does direct Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde, which I think is quite a sexy sort of transgender take on a horror cliche. And that works quite well. And he's technically a very good director, but I don't get the sense that he had a very clear idea what to do with this movie. It is known that he thought the title was silly.
Oh shit!
I think we can all agree with him on that.
5 for 5.
But what a legacy that title has, though.
Well, yeah. I mean, if nothing else, it's the fact that it, that hopefully that our podcast is the thing that is the most successful and memorable thing about the title.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm going to manifest that.
Do it.
Yeah, I like that. That's the way I'm going to think about it from now on. So, guys, I'm aware that we're close to the end of our time. So before we wrap up, has any of you got any final thoughts you'd like to express about this movie?
Boobs.
That was the first thought and the final thought from at least two of you. Kirsty, have you got anything else?
No, bonnets. Bonnets more than boobs.
Right.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Stunning bonnet work. Stunning.
Amazing bonnets. Incredible.
There's not a magazine called Bonnets and Boobs. Then
Niche.
Yeah.
My final thought then is that I've not been able to get the love theme of this movie out of my head for the last 3 days. And I don't like it. I don't like that kind of lush 70s romantic music. I would really hope that like a metal band or at least like a prog rock band would do a cover of this, because I thought the melody, there must be something about it. Why is it going into my head? I think the melody's quite good, but all those kind of lush strings and things.
Well, I tell you what, one thing that stood out at me talking the music, the not the love theme, but the horrible stabbing stuff every time she saw something scary was just overbearing.
It is.
Yeah.
I mean, it is. Yeah, that is exactly the stuff that Howard was talking about when he was saying it's the music from Asylum. In that movie, it works better, though. I think in this film, because the movie doesn't know what it wants to be, it kind of comes out of nowhere. Is it a romance or is it a gory
It's
horror movie? Or
definitely not romance. I mean, if that's like no, just no.
No.
I think the music thinks it is.
Well, no, and that's to be honest, that worries me. That the music.
Yeah.
You know, it's sort of like looking a little bit like there's a scene in is it Goldfinger or one of the kind of early Bond ones where it's it's essentially a rape scene in some straw, and the music's like
with Honor Blackman, yeah,
and it's like no, she is saying no, stop it.
Yes,
Anyway.
that's a really uncomfortable scene.
Yeah, it's grim.
Well, what's happening here is not as grim as that situation where the music has just totally misread the situation. I just think that the music in this movie seems to think that the film is a tragic romance with an underlayer of horror shock to it, whereas I think it should be an exciting horror story with an underlay of tragic romance. But maybe that's just me. Well, there we go then. And now the screaming starts. At last, the screaming has stopped.
Hey.
Thank you so much, Kirsty. Thank you, Stella. Thank you,
Screaming
Ian.
start, Dan. Chloe.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Dan.
The lambs, Chloe. Thank you so much, listener. We hope you have a wonderful Halloween, and please join us again for our next episode, where we'll all be here to discuss horror franchises. That episode comes out in a week's time, although the episode is available to Patreon supporters right now on our Patreon page, and releases of subsequent episodes will be on every Friday thereafter. In the meantime, take good care of yourself. Bye-bye.
Bye. Boobs.
Boobs.
You have been listening to And Now the Podcast Starts, an Ambisol podcast, presented by Kirsty Warrow, T.D. Velasquez, Dr. Stella Gaynor, Ian Winterton, and Howard Whittaker.
Hello?
Howard, there's something very important I forgot to say to you.
What?
Happy Halloween.
Oh, yeah, happy Halloween, yes. Doesn't time fly when you're having fun?
Special thanks to Greg Hume for our original theme music. Our original artwork is by Kirsty Warrow. Please search One Crow Left on Instagram, Etsy, or Redbubble to see and purchase more of Kirsty's work. All clips from films, TV shows, trailers, and musical works are used for the purposes of criticism in the spirit of fair use as defined in the US law and fair dealing as defined in the laws of Commonwealth nations. No copyright infringement is intended. Please visit our home on the web, andnowpodcast.com, for more content and contact details. You can follow us on Mastodon, Blue Sky, and even Twitter, which we refuse to call X, it's an insult, X the unknown. Our handle for each is @andnowpodcast. Meanwhile, Threads and Instagram users need simply search @andnowpodcast. On Facebook, search @andnowpod. If you'd like to donate to help us with the costs of making the podcast, please visit patreon.com/andnowpodcast. Donors get early access to upcoming content and other exclusives. This podcast was produced and released by Ambidextrous Solutions Limited. And now, the podcast...
Have you no fear of what might happen?
...stops.